Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Aman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, we're going to be rating some of your teams that were sent to me on Twitter. Thank you everyone who submitted their teams. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get to everyone, but hopefully you found some value out of this anyway. If you guys do enjoy it, do appreciate a thumbs up. Do please consider subscribing as well to the channel if you want to see more content, and let's get straight into it. And so before I wanted to actually get into your specific teams, I wanted to grab from the SuperCoach website what would be the most popular team in terms of pure ownership stats. And I think it's quite interesting because based on a lot of the teams that I saw on Twitter, there's about 40 something teams that were sent to me. A lot of these players really don't feature anymore. So I think there's definitely a change in kind of the online, more engaged coaches perspective compared to maybe what is currently on the SuperCoach website. A lot of that could just be due to people setting their team and not really looking at it again until TLT, which is fair enough. And to timestamp this, I am recording on the Sunday just prior to TLT. But I'm looking at this list of players here. There's a few players who I really didn't see in a lot of teams. The main one for me was probably Luke Garner. I think that World Club Challenge really has seen his ownership start to reduce. He still is one of the higher owned kind of second row forwards, but a lot of other mid-range second row forwards are putting their hands up, the likes of Teague Wilton, Murata Nuakore, Eli Katoa, Egan Butcher, Kelma Tuolangi as well from Manly. A lot of options who could fill that spot, and I didn't see Luke Garner in really any team that was sent to me. So one that is quite different to what's currently on the website. Another one was Matt Burton. Starting to see Matt Burton not really appear in too many teams. Adam Dewey seems to definitely be the favourite 5'8 now out of that kind of 50-50 choice. I think after the Bulldogs performance in the trials as well, a few people probably thinking that Burton might not quite get to the hot start that they were expecting. So not really seeing Burton in a lot of teams, but he still is very highly owned and the most popular 5'8 as well on the SuperCoach website. What I think is also very interesting is Val Holmes being present in the most highly owned centre wing. It's kind of against the grain typically of SuperCoach, where we would normally start the season quite cheap in the centre wing, but I think a lot of people are just looking at that Cowboys draw, looking at Val Holmes as a goal kicker, and are willing to spend over 700k on a centre wing. That's a bit different to what I've seen in previous seasons, but the likes of Nickel Klukstad, Taruva do feature in quite a few teams, but Tabai Fido as well, very popular on the website, but not really seeing him in a lot of teams as well, at least in the ones that were sent to me on Twitter, and I think probably what the more engaged coaches are looking at. So that's something that I would also just keep in mind. I did try to pick out different teams that were sent to me that had slight variations to it, just so I wasn't going through the same team over and over. And so a lot of these players do feature in that, but there are some differences that we'll get onto just now. So the first team that I wanted to talk about came from D-Way Good. He's currently got 27.5k in his salary cap, and he's got a pretty popular combination of cheap hookers in Brandon Smith and Tanner Boyd. Now I'm personally running the Harry Grant Brandon Smith combination because I really just love Harry Grant as a starting option in my team. I think he's going to be the best SuperCoach hooker this season, but I can see the appeal of Tanner Boyd, and I don't for one think that Tanner Boyd is a bad option. I would just prefer to try to start with Harry Grant, and if I need to trade down to Tanner Boyd, I can. But so that's a slight con in my opinion, not starting with Harry Grant, but I do understand that it's a minor con. You can't start with everyone at the beginning of the season. I think he's used the money well though. He's stacked the halves with Cleary and Hines. He's got Adam Dewey as a more popular 5'8 option. Isaiah Katoa, very recent news as well out of the Dolphins was that potentially Katoa could get the first crack at the 5'8 spot for the Dolphins, which would be a big kind of relief, I guess, for all that Josh Schuster issue that we had with him not being available for the first round of the season. So I think he's plugged him straight away in there. I like his second row forward. It's a little bit different, but I still do think it's quite good. Joe Tarpany I think is fantastic. To be honest though, a slight con as well, just team structure wise, I would try to get Tarpany in front row forward. In general, I think front row forward is a weaker position than the second row forward, and I think if you can, I would probably try to get that money up from Tarpany into the front row forward. His front row forward is still pretty good though with Cotter and Christian Welch. Another thing I should also point out that Christian Welch is definitely starting to appear as a kind of mid-range front row forward that I think a lot of people are going for. You're going to see a lot of Welch or Kamanu setups in the next few teams that we go through. The one thing I could maybe think about offering as a suggestion is I personally would like to have Tarpany in the front row forward, and so if you can instead replace Cotter with him, and then you've got 620k to play with in your second row forward, add another 20k that you've got currently in your cap. I, to be honest, would actually look to downgrade Nat Butcher as well. I'm slightly less keen on Butcher than what I was kind of earlier in the preseason, and a lot of that was just due to, I think, the emergence of all these kind of 400k second row forwards. I think, to be honest, with unfortunately what's happening with Angus Crichton, condolences go out to him. There's just real no kind of definite period as to when he's returning. And I think someone like Egan Butcher could actually be a nice kind of alternative compared to, say, Nat Butcher. And he's quite a big saving as well on Nat Butcher. So even if you wanted to go for like an Egan Butcher, if you still wanted a kind of Roosters back rower, maybe a Teague Wilton, maybe a Nuakore, I think there's a good way for you to actually save like 100k. And then that way you've got 100k plus on your Cotter, plus your 20k in the bank. You could actually even stretch up to someone like Cam Murray. All of a sudden then you've got Cam Murray, maybe a mid-range second row forward, Hopgood as your third, Trent Loiero is probably going to be pretty decent value, as well as Jackson Ford and Matt Dury. And then your front row forward is now looking at Tarpany, Welch, and just the balance of those forwards, in my opinion, looks a little bit better in that sense. But I can see the appeal of Cotter as well. And just moving on to your backs, I think they're pretty good. Obviously, we've already mentioned the halves. In the center wing, you've got the very popular Val Holmes, which I do like, able to capitalize on the Cowboys draw. But D. Wagood is actually doubling down, going with Scott Drinkwater as well as his pod fullback. So this is a combination of fullbacks I haven't quite seen, Drinkwater and Trbojevic. Most people are having Turbo and then one of Teddy or Latrell. I think Drinkwater, as I mentioned in a couple of videos, he probably would be the pod fullback that I would go for. I would just be conscious as well that you are obviously stacking in quite a few Cowboys, which isn't a bad thing. They've got a fantastic draw and very good for buy coverage. Their first buy is not for a while, so there's a clear runway of games that you'll get out of these guys. So I think, you are avoiding the early tough draw for Latrell, and you are also avoiding that early buy as well for Tedesco. So I think with the money that you've got, I don't mind that compromise, going slightly down from Tedesco. And I think you are still also getting an extra Roosters player there with that kind of, edge back rower in a Butcher. If it's Nat Butcher, maybe it's an Egan Butcher instead. So I quite like the balance of that. And I actually think you've got a decent pod as well in Greg Marzu. Now, personally, if I was going for a pod center wing around that price range, I would probably go for Murray Taulagi instead, but I understand why you may not have gone with him, given that you do already have Val Holmes and Scott Drinkwater. So I don't mind Marzu. Knights do have a pretty decent start to the season as well. He showed his form in the trials as well. He's got that upside. The issue with Marzu has always been defense, and that's what lets him down and, what's led to him kind of getting dropped out of teams. But I think as a punt to begin the season, I honestly don't mind it. And what I like about the team as well is price points. I think you've covered quite a few good price points. You've got maybe aside from the hooker spot, every other position you've got a place where you could maybe downgrade to try to unlock funds. And so I think obviously the biggest compromise is no Harry Grant. You don't have Brian To'o as well. Maybe if you were able to shave some money elsewhere, instead of Nat Butcher, you went down to an Egan Butcher, but you kept Cotter and Tarpany. Maybe then instead of Marzu, you could go To'o. Now that's obviously going to get you a lot more closer to probably the more popular player, but I would personally feel more comfortable as well having someone like To'o, playing for a Panthers team, and also given this injury to Taylor May, we should hopefully see it in TLT. But if Brian To'o is named on the left wing for the Panthers, for me he's almost close to a must, because I just know that the left wing spot for the Panthers is their go-to side, and that's where Brian To'o had his incredible 2021 season as well from a SuperCoach standpoint. So that's also something to think about. But to be honest, I don't mind the rest of the team. I think you've done good use of the no Harry Grant money. There's a couple of tweaks that I would make just from a personal feeling, but overall I think a pretty strong squad. Now, the next team that I'm going to feature is from AD21236841. A lot of numbers there. The reason why I wanted to show his team was, look, it's the same hooker combination, but I think the second row forward is a little bit different to what we saw in the previous team. So he's gone real heavy with Cam Murray, Pat Carrigan, and Teague Wilton. It was actually interesting to see how many teams had this same three trio of second row forwards. Cam Murray, I think, is probably the best second row forward gun that you'd go for, just considering price into it. Like Zay Papali'i is probably a bit too expensive. Fifita could be a bit too inconsistent for you. Someone like Cam Murray, you're paying another 50-60k on Fifita, but you're probably going to get very consistent, minimum 65 to 7, probably 65 each week. A good chance he gets to 70 to 80 in every other week as well. And with a tough draw to begin the season, to be honest, it doesn't really matter with someone like Cam Murray. He's that important to the Rabbitohs team. He's definitely someone who I don't currently have in my team, who I'd love to have. It's just a price thing for me at the moment, but you've been able to get there, and probably not having Harry Grant has enabled that. And so I think this is where one of the instances where I like that you've gone for probably what I'd consider the best in that position if you are going to sacrifice the best in another position. And yeah, Carrigan, I've seen in quite a few teams as well. He's getting much more popular. I do think that there is going to be value in him at 650k. Probably he's going from a 62 average to probably closer to about a 65, 66. And so I think, being the club captain as well, I think he'll continue to get good minutes and just continually improve as a player overall. So currently, again, not in my team. He's one of those players who I'm currently looking at anti-potting. For me, that's just because of the feeling. I don't think he's going to hurt me. I think he'll be good for you, but I don't think he'll be someone who's going to punch out kind of that 80 to 90 any other week. That would really hurt me. I think he'll punch out 65 to 70 very consistently, and I think that'll be very good value for you. And to be honest, I'd prefer someone like a Carrigan to maybe someone like a Nanai. I know Nanai's about a similar price and has the better draw, but he's probably too inconsistent for my liking. Carrigan is the complete opposite of inconsistency. You know what you're going to get from him every week. So I do like that pick in that sense. Decent second row forward bench as well in Hopgood and Trent Loiero. Jake Preston as well. Wacko Whispers has just tweeted, I think last week, that Preston is going to get a spot in the starting 17 for the Bulldogs, which I think probably makes him more interesting of an option than, say, someone like I believe it's Trey Mooney, might be 230k. I could be wrong on that sense. But there's another couple of other second row forward cheapies who are about 230k. You may as well just take the 30k price saving if Preston is indeed named in the 17. So I like that selection as well. And I think Teague Wilton is one of the better mid-range second row forwards as well. I know there's a risk of minutes there with, Wade Graham on the bench, but we expect Teague Wilton to be starting. And I think we saw in the trials as well how much better he is probably for the Sharks attack compared to someone like Wade Graham. So I would expect Teague Wilton to get hopefully improved minutes from last season, and I think if he's playing above 60 to 65, he's probably going to be worth it at his price tag. So I do like him as a selection as well. The halves I'm not really going to go into. They're pretty standard and I like them as well. Just I wanted to quickly touch on the centers. I do consider them a little bit weaker than probably some of the other teams that I called out, which is what I wanted to mention. So obviously Val Holmes I rate, and also Isaac Thompson. Remus Smith and Tommy Talau as your kind of third and fourth center wing does give me a little bit more of a hesitation. Remus Smith I've found historically never is fantastic Supercoach wise, and Tommy Talau had a good season in 2021. I'm just not comfortable relying on them, I think, as my third and fourth center wing, week in, week out. To be honest, I'd probably rather play someone like Khan Pereira or even Will Warbrick, and they could turn out to be really good cheap center wings that we can actually play every week. When it's an unknown at this stage of the season, I'd personally try to upgrade the third and fourth center wing, and the way I do that, to be honest, is probably by downgrading Scott Drinkwater. I know I mentioned Scott Drinkwater as a good option in the last team that we rated, but I would probably go just down to someone like Turbo. I think Turbo's value is ridiculous. You're then freeing up about 160k. Maybe if you take a bit of a price cut as well on someone like a Carrigan, if you went down to maybe someone like in that 500k range, let's say hypothetically a Nat Butcher, or even if you went even cheaper to another mid-range second row forward, someone like a Murata Niokore, then all of a sudden you're sitting with about 300k that you could then pump straight into your center wings. Remus Smith could automatically then go up to someone like Brian To'o, and then I'd be much more comfortable, I think, with that center wing setup, and I don't think you're losing out too much in your second row forwards either. And one thing I will mention with those mid-ranges second row forwards, I think this issue with Josh Schuster does help in the sense that you don't need to start with him, and especially if Isaiah Katoa does get the nod in round one, that really does help out from a structure sense, because then what I'm personally looking at doing, and what this team could also think about doing, is having a couple more mid-ranges in second row forward, and whatever one underperforms, that one can be the sacrifice to Josh Schuster when he does return, just before his price rise. And so that's what I'm thinking about, taking a punt on maybe one or two more extra mid-range second row forwards, because I do think that there's quite a few good options. And so I'm not personally looking to stack my second row forward as much. I'll probably start with at least one gun, but going for two, I think there's enough other solid options that I'd like to move that money around to other weaker positions, like say a center wing, where I've got less faith in the cheaper options. So that's maybe one suggestion I would also make with this team, but a few tweaks, and I think overall it's a pretty solid squad. Now the next team is from Azza_RL, and so there's a few things I do like about his team. I think he spent the money well in the hooker and the halves, and that he's been able to allocate a lot of funds there, going with Harry Grant and Brandon Smith, which is my combination, and also having Nathan Cleary and Nico Hines, and obviously I haven't mentioned it yet in the video, slight doubt about Nico Hines starting in round one. There's a few other teams that we'll get into that don't have Nico Hines, so I'll probably speak about that a little bit more when we get to those teams. The 5'8 spot, I like Adam Dewey, and I do like that you are spending up and getting another decent 5'8 option, but Tom Dearden, I don't think he's probably the one that I'd personally advocate for. I think what I would do instead, just looking at this current setup, is one thing I don't like is the fullbacks. Drinkwater is fine, but Taruva as a second fullback, I would highly recommend just going back to my fullback video. At the start of that video, I discussed the kind of the high upside of that fullback position. I personally just don't think it's a position that you can sacrifice on and go for a cheapie. I really do think you need to try to go for at least a gun and a mid-ranger, but ideally two guns. So I think Drinkwater, Teddy, Turbo, Latrell, those are the type of guys that I'd be targeting, and I just don't think there's scope to have a cheap center wing there. I think Taruva is going to be good, but I would put him in place for one of your center wings instead, maybe someone like an Isaac Thompson, or maybe a Sean Russell replacement instead. And I'd probably use that Tom Dearden money, and I'd go for Turbo. Turbo is coming in cheaper than Tom Dearden, so I know it's a very easy suggestion, and it's bringing your team much more in line to the majority of teams, but I do think that that's what I would do with the money. I would try to reallocate the funds, try to swap Tom Dearden for Turbo, Go a little bit cheaper in the 5'8 with Katoa if he does get named for round 1. That's obviously a big if. We're still waiting on. And I think at that point, I would just move Taruva into one of your center wing spots as well. And then overall, I think the team, I know I've made those suggestions. To be honest, at that point, the team is going to be almost identical to what my team is like. So I would say, yes, obviously I like it at that point. You do have Cam Murray, which I don't have. I've got Fafita, so I like the Cam Murray selection. I've seen a few people say that they don't recommend starting with Hopgood as a starting second row forward. I personally am feeling okay about it. It's more probably a question of the depth on the second row forward. It won't be as good at that point. But Hopgood, I'm comfortable enough playing, I think, as a third second row forward, at least for the first 3 weeks. Just the way he plays in his game style, it gives me some confidence that I think he'll probably punch out 55 to 60, I think, at least in those first 3 weeks. So he'll definitely do a job in those early rounds. And at that point, we can start making money. We can start upgrading some players. So I don't also mind that you've got Hopgood as your third kind of second row forward. And the bench options, probably Maverick Gaia, I'll just mention, as more of a general team structure point. This season, the fact that we've got to buy every week, I really just don't think there's any scope to be having non-players in our squads. I really do think we need to have a full playing 25. So Maverick Gaia, I'd probably swap for someone like a Jacob Preston if he gets named. And then similar, say, with Franklin Pele. It's looking like Pele's not going to get a spot in this top 17. So you're then going to have to think about how can you maybe upgrade him to someone like, say, a Sean Kepi as a playing bench front row forward. So that's some of the things that I also think about as well with your team, just in terms of reallocating funds. So, if you go downgrading Tom Dearden, getting Turbo, that's about a 40k difference there. That would help you then get up to someone like a Kepi, but also Maverick Gaia, swap for a Preston. And I think it's just really important this season to get a full playing 25. So those are some of my thoughts of what I think could improve this team. And to be honest, that probably makes it very close to my team. But at that point, I do think it is probably going to look a little bit stronger than what it currently is. So the next team comes from Ben with no number. And I really wanted to talk about this team because I know Ben very well and he loves the pod and he loves playing his own style very differently. And this team is the definition of different. I really haven't seen any other team that looks like this. To be honest, this is more like the traditional SuperCoach setup with a very cheap center wing. His most expensive center wing is Charles Nickel-Klukstad. Then he's gone Taruva and then a bunch of cheapies in Talau, Alamotti, Warbrick, Camperera, and Ben Travojevic, with a pretty common fullback combination of Tedesco and Travojevic. Now, the hookers, let's start with them. So Harry Grant, obviously a big plus, and Damien Cook. This is really the only team that I've seen that actually has Damien Cook to start off with, and he's really put the money into the spine positions, like the fullbacks, the hookers, the halves, and the 5'8s. They're absolutely stacked with guns, and I do think that it's something different, but I think that can also work out for you at the beginning of the season. The biggest risk is obviously the reliance on the weak center wing, if I can call it that. Val Holmes is becoming very, very popular. Someone like a Brian To'o, if he plays on the left wing, I think is going to be a really, really good option as well. And they both come in cheaper than someone like Damien Cook. You really do need Damien Cook to have a blinding kind of first 6 weeks, I think, to get good value out of him. He showed his class in that preseason game against the Dragons. I just think with the run of games being a bit tougher for the Rabbitohs, I just don't see Damien Cook maybe pushing past that kind of 70 to 75 range too often. He might get around that 65 range. I'm just taking a bet that I think he'll go down in price a little bit at the beginning of the season. And I think we've got other good cheap options in Brandon Smith, maybe a Tanner Boyd, potentially even Sonny Luke as well, sight unseen in the trials, but the talk is that he should be getting 50 to 55 minutes at hooker spot. So I think there's going to be enough good cheap hooker options that I think I'd be willing to sacrifice Damien Cook and then plump that money into the center wing. And that would probably be the only recommendation I'd make about this team. Overall, I like the rest of it. I know the cheap front row forward is a bit of a risk, but I'm running that currently. I think Welch and Oitokumanu should hopefully kind of hold their own, and Kepi should hopefully do a job as well as a bench front row forward. I like the Fafita pick. He's got the upside. Ben's gone with Katoa as his mid-range second row forward. I like the fact that he's playing off Jerome Hughes on the right. I believe that's what he was playing in the trials. So I think there's a good chance for him to get those short balls, maybe a few easy tries. And I think at his price tag, if he gets good minutes starting, I think he's going to be one of those more compelling mid-range second row forwards. And then Hopgood as his third second row forward. Again, I don't mind that as well. At the moment, Ben, also just let me know in the comments below if you're looking at holding Schuster and not having someone else there in his place, because I'm personally leaning towards not starting with Schuster and having someone else in their place, maybe someone like a Matt Dury, maybe a Jacob Preston. I think there's enough good second row forwards that we can maybe make some money. Hopefully we've made a couple of price rises, then you can then trade down to him. And I think it's not a bad use of a trade if you can make like hopefully 100k by downgrading to someone like Schuster in round 5. So that's one thing I would maybe just recommend as well. I think there's enough good second row forward options where you can maybe avoid starting with Schuster to begin the season. But Munster, this is probably the only team that got sent to me that includes Cam Munster. Cam Munster is still very under-owned. I know there was a bit of talk that he was battling with, like, I think it's osteitis pubis, quote me if I'm wrong, NRL physio, but it was a bit of a groin complaint. But I think Munster showed even in that trials game, even when he's not 100%, he only needs a couple of moments where he can set up a try, break the line, and he's going to get you his kind of 70, 75 that he gets every other week. I think the reason why Munster is just not in as many teams is 848k is more expensive than Cleary, but I just don't think you're going to really be captaining Munster too often. At least that's my opinion anyway. I could be wrong on that. And I think someone like Dewey is maybe presenting similar points potential for the first few weeks, but at a much cheaper price. I personally haven't really considered Munster as well, but I think it's interesting that you're going with him, and I think we all know what of a gun Munster is, but I personally think that the money could be better spent elsewhere, like maybe someone like a Val Holmes, maybe to take more of a chance on the good draw of the Cowboys and the goal kicker. But honestly, I can't fault the Munster pick. He is an out-and-out Supercoach gun, and we could all be in 3 weeks' time just thinking, why the hell did we just not start with Munster? We know what he is, we know what he can deliver, but were we all just being a bit too clever for our own good? So I think the Munster pick can work out for Ben. I'm personally just not going to go there for the beginning of the season, but we could all be licking our wounds come round 4. Now, the next team comes from Chris55788246. The reason why I wanted to talk about Chris's team was this was one of the few teams that I saw that didn't have Nathan Cleary. Now, I'm personally not willing to antipod Nathan Cleary. His ownership is now up to 52%, I believe, at the time of recording, which is crazy high ownership for someone like Cleary. Now he's got the buy in round 3, but to be honest, I know Cleary is going to be someone who I'm going to want in the long term anyway. So for me, I'm going to just start with Nathan Cleary, but I like the option of Sam Walker. He probably is the third or fourth best halfback that you could go for, maybe including Jerome Hughes in that category as well. And Sam Walker's obviously got a fantastic first 2 games with the Dolphins and then the Warriors. Just what I saw from the Roosters, I think we're going to be okay, in the season, but we saw it last year as well. We were a little bit clunky at the beginning of the season, and I think now that we've integrated someone like Brandon Smith, yes, I know the first 2 games are easy. I just wonder how slick the Roosters are going to be at the beginning of the season. And then you've got the Rabbitohs in round 3 and then a bye in round 4. I would go with Sam Walker if you were starting with Nathan Cleary, because I think at that point that Sam Walker has his bye in round 4, I believe is when Nicho Hynes has the Dragons, and I think that's the time when you might want to make the switch. And so personally, I would run with the Cleary Sam Walker combination. Unless, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe your strategy is that you're going to start without Cleary, wait for his bye in round 3, and then in round 4, you're going to upgrade Sam Walker to Cleary when he's back. To be honest, that's probably not a bad strategy either. So if that is your plan, I don't mind it. But I think then obviously that requires a lot of the other things in your team to go right. So that is a bit of a risk there, I guess, if that is your strategy. And let's talk about the Kalen Ponga pick as well at 5'8". He's not my favorite pod, if I can call it that, because if we do get Isaiah Katoa, I'd much rather just take that price saving and start with him. Ponga is obviously a little bit of a risk. He's not my favorite, but there is a good chance that if we don't get Katoa, I might start with Ponga anyway, just to kind of cover the price point, and then if he flops in the first 4 or 5 weeks, I'll just trade down to Schuster. So I can see the merit in starting with Ponga, but it just didn't work for my current team setup. And your other main pod is Nick Meaney, who I don't mind again, but I just don't think that Meaney is, again, my favorite pod because, again, I'll mention Brian To'o as a similar example. He's very similarly priced to Nick Meaney, but I think To'o on the left wing is probably going to be the same, if not better, I think, than Nick Meaney. Meaney's going to be solid for you, and the fact that his goal kicking is helpful. But if you refer back to my center wing video, I just found that Nick Meaney didn't quite have the ceiling, even with being a goal kicker, whereas someone like Brian To'o gets 1 try and he's already getting close to about 70, 80 points. He can very easily score a double in any week, and you're getting close to 100 points. I just don't think Meaney is going to quite match that, especially if To'o is playing on the left. So if it were me personally, I would switch to To'o instead of Nick Meaney, because you are also having another pod there in Greg Marzu. I mentioned Marzu as well earlier in the video. Slight risks with him, and I think doubling with Marzu and Ponga could maybe be a slight recipe for disaster, because honestly, I wasn't too thrilled with what I saw from the Knights from the beginning of the season. So personally, I would also just try to minimize my exposure to either one of those teams and maybe drop one of Ponga or Marzu, but I can see why you're taking the chance with them with their good draw. Same thought with Drinkwater as well. So there's definitely a few pods I think that kind of dotted around the team, which I don't mind. Some of them I don't mind, like a Sam Walker or a Drinkwater, but Ponga and Marzu and Meaney, a couple of pods where I think maybe it's just a bit more sensible just to go with maybe a higher owned option. And even Drinkwater, if you drop down to turbo. All of a sudden, you've got heaps of money that you've got floating around. Maybe a bench second row forward in Ray Stone could get up to like a Trent Loiero. Maybe that's another suggestion that I could offer. Or maybe you just try to find some money to upgrade Sam Walker to Nathan Cleary. So I don't mind the setup in that, let's say you start with Marzu Ponga, they flop, and you think, okay, that's it. I'm going to downgrade Ponga to say like a Katoa, maybe a Schuster's back by that point, and that's your money to get up from Sam Walker to Cleary. I don't mind that as a strategy, and you are getting around the buys in that sense as well. So I think if you are looking to antipod Cleary, I don't mind this team as a template because it allows for a few price points where you can downgrade to try to enable that upgrade to Cleary in a few weeks' time. And the final team that I'm going to cover is from David Shu 26. So a pretty standard kind of hooker combination of Harry Grant and Brandon Smith. He's got Ruben Cotter instead of Christian Welch. So he's got a slightly stronger front row forward than probably a lot of the other teams that we featured here, which had the Welch or Kamanu combination. Although the bench front row forward in Fafita, I think it's Viliami Fafita if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure if he's going to get a run in the Manly 17. So I'd personally look to bump him up to someone like maybe a Sean Kepi, I think. So it's about 70k that you'd need to free up to do that, but there is a way of doing that potentially from going from Schuster down to Isaiah Katoa, and unfortunately I wasn't told what the remaining salary cap was in this team, but maybe that's a way for you to get up to someone like a Sean Kepi, because I do think that it is going to be very important to try to get a full playing at 25 this season. I like the second row forward guns that you've gone for in Cam Murray and Dave Fafita. As I mentioned though, I do think that there is some good options in the mid-range second row forward, and I would try to actually, if possible, go for one of them instead of a Murray or Fafita. So I think take your fancy of Murray or Fafita. Maybe you stick with Murray. Fafita down to say, let's say hypothetically like Tig Wilton. That's 200k right there that you're saving. All of a sudden you can use that to upgrade Viliami Fafita. You could even maybe use that to get up to say Nico Hines if you're upgrading from Sam Walker. But I don't mind the team overall if, say, let's say hypothetically Nico Hines isn't available for round 1. It's a big question then, do you start with him? Because 900k sitting on your bench for a week is a lot of money just sitting there. And especially when you've got someone like Sam Walker versus the Dolphins, you could just make the change of Hines to Sam Walker, but leave all the money left in your cap. And then you can at least get the points potentially from that Dolphins-Warriors game, and then you make the switch to Hines in round 4 when Sam Walker has his bye. So I like this team setup in that sense. I think in the situation where Hines isn't available for the first week, then overall I think it's a pretty good setup in my opinion. Pretty decent centering options in Val Holmes and Brian To'o. So I think this team's a little bit more on the template side, apart from not having Nico Hines. But I think he's used the Nico Hines money well. Sorry, I've also just deleted a comment that was left over from one of the other teams, which was antipod Cleary risk. Obviously, Dave has got Cleary in his current setup as well. But overall, I like the team setup. I think it's got a few pretty template picks, couple of changes and tweaks I'd make. But overall, I think for a non-Nico Hines team, I quite like it. And so to wrap up the video, I wanted to kind of leave you with a few of my thoughts just after looking at about 45-something teams that got sent to me on Twitter. Rabbitohs players, apart from Cam Murray, are definite pods at the moment. None of the teams that I featured showed Latrell. There were a couple of teams that were sent to me that did include Latrell, but really, he wasn't featuring in a lot of teams. So Latrell is a serious pod, and Damien Cook really is also a good pod as well. So I think if you're somewhat iffy on the Roosters, maybe being a bit clunky at the beginning of the season, I know they've got a tough draw, but the goal kicker, maybe you just want to go for Latrell. I think if you're not completely locked in on Tedesco, I think it's give Latrell some serious thought, because I think he's still very much a pod and really could get you ahead of the curve for the first few weeks of the season. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Luke Garner really not featuring in any teams, and I think I'm also the same position where you've got that bye now in round 3 for the Panthers. I think it's fine to say wait and watch for the first few weeks, and then we can make a switch from another mid-range second row forward, but really not too keen on him at the moment. Matt Burton's interest is definitely cooling off as well. Really didn't see many teams including Matt Burton. I think the pendulum has definitely swung towards Adam Doueihi, and I think that's okay, but obviously we still should be remaining thoughtful as to why we were also keen on Matt Burton to begin with. He is the goal kicker for what we think will be an improved Bulldogs team, but I'm also of the feeling that we can maybe wait and watch for it to happen as well. And Cam Munster still remains probably way too under-owned. He's about 14% ownership, but I think that for someone like Munster, it's surprising to not see that over 20%. We've talked about it a lot in this video, but more and more people I think are leaning towards those mid-ranges in the second row forward, and I'm definitely of that opinion, because there's a lot of good options that I've just listed here that I think you can use as somewhat of a compromise in your second row forward. I think a lot of players around that 500k range, like the Adam Elliott's, who I think now is having a little bit of an injury niggle, which might not make him fully fit for round 1. you've got an equivalent to Nat Butcher, maybe an Egan Butcher now as well. So I think I do like, if you have got like a 500k-ish second row forward in your team, I probably would just prefer to drop them down to someone in the 400s, like one of these options here. It just frees up more money for you to do elsewhere in your team. But there are a few gun second row forwards who are remaining as pods. Someone like a Jeremiah Nanai, someone like an Olukwatu didn't feature in any of the teams that I showed here. They could maybe be a pod to someone like a Pat Carrigan, who's getting quite high ownership. I'd probably lean towards maybe going with an Olukwatu over a Carrigan, just because we know that Olukwatu has got some upside. Downside with Olukwatu though is that he does have a buy fairly early on in round 2, but maybe an option to consider from round 3 onwards. Cleary, Nico Hines is definitely the preferred halfback combination, so I think if you are anti-potting one of these two, might make it a bit easier for us if indeed Nico Hines is a doubt or is unavailable for round 1 in terms of making the decision easier for us. But if they're both fit for round 1, if you are anti-potting, definitely try to have a plan, I think, to get to one of these two players, because they're going to be very highly owned, and if they do well at the beginning, it could really hurt you. Val Holmes is at a pretty high ownership as well, which kind of goes against the SuperCoach grain. So at over 700k, I think he's looking like the main way for people to get into that Cowboys attack. I'm definitely of the same opinion as well. So would kind of, have some thoughts about that as well if you don't have any Cowboys players in your squad. And the final thought I wanted to show as well was that Tino Fasumala-Awi, he also remains a pretty big pod. Didn't feature in any of the teams that I showed here. I do think that I would prefer someone like a Joe Tarpany or a Ruben Cotter just to begin the season. I think Tarpany for the same price probably has slightly higher upside, and I think Cotter can somewhat match Tino but at a cheaper price. But Tino is definitely still worth consideration. I think maybe someone to consider after the Titans have a bye in round 5. Well, that's it, guys. That is my Rate My Teams video in the preseason. Hopefully you all enjoyed that and got some value out of it, even if your team wasn't rated. But do give the video a like if you did enjoy it. Do please consider hitting subscribe as well if you enjoyed the content. And I'll see you all in the next video.